Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
But there isn't an alcoholic gene, one singular gene. And I think that's really encouraging because it means that there's hope and freedom for anybody, that it doesn't matter necessarily that your parents struggled, that there is freedom is on the table for you.
I'm Julie Lyles Carr, and you're listening to the AllMomDoes podcast, part of the Purposely Podcast Network. Get ready for some great inspiration for the life you're living, the kids you're raising, the marriage that you're nurturing, and the faith walk you're walking, right here on the AllMomDoes podcast. I want to get really practical in this moment for the listener who's going, I feel like the Holy Spirit is kind of making me pay attention here. There's something in my spirit that I'm needing to really think about. I've heard it said before, you mentioned that alcohol will give you a little 30-minute dopamine, burst, take you up a little bit. Mm-hmm. I've heard it said before, both in relation to certain kinds of foods and some of the addictive natures of some of the foods that we consume, and in relationship to alcohol, other substances, that generally when there is this craving for something, there's a 30-minute window, we've just talked about a 30-minute window of kind of the benefit you get, but there's a 30-minute window in which if you can pre-decide how you're going to, that you're aware, it's okay, for about 30 minutes, I'm going to really crave this. And I have these opportunities to distract myself, recenter my focus, open my Bible. There are a lot of things that we could do in the interim. I wanted to ask first if you found that to be true in the research that you've done, that sometimes if we can also realize that there's a window of craving that can be intense, but it's not a 24-hour window. Is that true?
Yes, it's so true. It's why this is normally hard for us at the end of the day, right? It's that 5 or 6 o'clock, like witching hour where the craving voice is the loudest.
Right.
And if you can interrupt that thought pattern, and I talk about so many practical ways to do this in the book. My favorite one, and the one that everybody just loves, is play the tape forward twice. So as you said, this is going to be a temporary thing that you are going to get through. What does the tape look like if you have, let's say, the one drink, right? Because it was always just the one or the one, maybe two. What does it look like if you have that drink, right? Because if you play that tape forward, for me, I'm not going to sleep very well. I'm going to snap at the kids the next morning. I'm going to miss that workout that I pre-booked. I'm going to feel crappy, like all of those things. But if I don't have the drink, then what does my evening look like? I maybe get a good night's sleep, right? I don't snap at my husband when he comes in late. I wake up feeling good. And that play the tape forward twice. So once having the drink, once not having the drink, just creates that space in that moment of like, okay, what does it look like if I have the drink? What if it looks like if I don't? And then you get to make the choice, right? And it gets easier and easier the more you say no to that craving voice. Like that is a hard, trodden neural pathway in our brains that if you've been drinking for decades like I was, it's hard to say no to for the first few times, but it does get easier and easier. And yes, it's temporary. It's one of my favorite lessons of this is that it feels like it's hours and hours. It's maybe 30 minutes. That's the loudest.
Right. It reminds me sometimes of how we advise moms with little babies, and it feels like the crying's going on forever. But if you can really look at the clock and realize that most crying jags are going to be 15 to 30 minutes, and you can kind of go, I can do this for 15 or 30 minutes. We're going to be okay. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of that same thing. I'm one of those people that if I can have a time on it, it's helpful to me, whether that's the workout or trying to avoid something. That's really helpful.
Yeah. You can even put a timer on. Yeah. Like I talk about that in the book too. Like put a timer on, figure out what the voice is saying, figure out what the job you're trying to give alcohol is. And if that's true, what does the Bible say about that? Where's the ultimate source for that unmet need you're trying to get? And see and how it feels after a 30-minute timer or a 20-minute timer. And did it dissipate? And if you keep doing that, like it will dissipate. The time length will go down over time.
Right. Absolutely. Talk to me too, in the research that you looked at, I'm finding women today, and I'm seeing more and more research that our levels of cortisol are so high. And I can look back at some peak times when I was trying to do all the things, Christy, from doing ministry and book launches and traveling a whole ton and all kinds of things that were going on, launching kids and parents with health issues and on and on. And I can look back at photographs of myself and go, wow, you can see the cortisol in my face. And this is not a fat shame thing or anything else. I'm saying you can see the effects of that stress on me physically, even though I was working out and doing the stuff and all the things. When I look at chronic stress loads in women today, and we're seeing more research on this, it's fascinating to me that alcohol actually also increases our cortisol. So was this a surprise to you to realize that connection, even though oftentimes we're trying to use it to reduce cortisol? And then what happens over time when cortisol, both from our environment and then from the things that we're ingesting, continues to climb this way?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's so fascinating. And I think the most fascinating part of it too, for me, was the difference that I felt. I remember like when I was like a nightly drinker, like things that were not hard, right? Yeah. Felt really stressful and really like insurmountable and hard. And then when the alcohol left my system and, you know, things started to regulate again, I could see things more clearly as not as difficult. But this is a hard one to like grasp and understand because of that 30-minute dopamine spike that we talked about, that dopamine spike and that feeling of relaxation that also comes. It's very temporary, but it does relax us for a time. But what we don't feel is then the adrenaline and the cortisol increase. It's why you wake up if you've had too much to drink at 3 a.m. It's because your cortisol and your adrenaline is like through the roof. And then you're staring at the ceiling, like wondering why you drank so much. But what I didn't really understand is that increased cortisol stays in your system for 7 to 10 days. So you might have a glass of wine to relax on a Saturday night. It's still making the kids harder for you on that Wednesday afternoon. And it's one of those things, again, where when you feel it, because you like eliminate alcohol and you give yourself grace and you experiment with this, you do feel it. And like you said, I mean, we are battling so much stress and cortisol coming at us from other reasons. Like, why ingest more of it, right? To make us more nervous and more anxious and feel worse.
Right. Do you think part of the challenge for us is that although I see strides in this, I still feel that a lot of us have a hard time identifying and naming the emotions that we're feeling and really 100%. Being able to observe that and say, oh, I'm feeling this way. I mean, we live in a culture that we have so many distractions available to us at any moment. And that can be everything from clicking on the podcast, although they should be listening to your podcast. They should be listening to this one. But we have a really hard time sitting and actually understanding what we're feeling. What role do you think for women alcohol has played in trying to mute the feeling instead of allowing us to just open it up and go, there it is?
Yeah. And a huge, right? One of the big jobs is numbing or just changing the state of emotion, right? Like I actually just was coaching before we popped on this podcast, and this gal was like, I want to, at the end of the day, just numb a little bit. And I said, but do you need to do that? Like, what do you really need to do that? Like, tell me, what is it that you need to numb? And she's like, well, no, actually my life is pretty okay right now. Right. I'm just in this this habit of numbing. And I think depending on, you know, who your parents were, how you were raised, but a lot of us as women were very much taught to, if you're feeling a hard emotion, like make it go away as fast as possible. You're crying, stop crying. You're angry, like sort that out. And alcohol is a very easy button answer to numb and change your state of emotion. And the problem is, right, is that those things that you're upset about or that you wanted to change are still there when the alcohol wears off. But because then we're dealing with an addictive drug, it becomes this habit. And so when we're not used to feeling feelings, right? Like, I mean, that was my thing, is I was really drinking to deal with heavy, heavy grief. And it wasn't until like maybe 8 months alcohol free back in California where I was like starting to actually feel the feels, name the feels, deal with the feelings, the complex layers of grief. naming them, as you said, bringing them to God and healing from them. But alcohol was like masking all of that,
Right.
that ability to feel and heal.
It is something I think we use as a distancer to keep something that feels overwhelming at a distance. And yet I've seen over and over, I'm sure you have too, that when we try to do that, when people we love try to do that, there does come a day of reckoning. Even if it's not the rock bottom that we proverbially talk about, we can only hold grief, hurt, abandonment, betrayal, all these things that, yes, are so hard to deal with in the moment, but we can only hold it at arm's length for so long. It's going to show up somewhere. The courage to say, I'm going to set this down. I don't need to be numb. I need to really let this get in and kind of mess me up and then figure out a path to healing is a really beautiful reminder. Christy, I can hear the listener to some degree saying, okay, but wait a minute. These things sound great. I get what you're saying, but what about the genetic component of addiction? What about those who we know are going to have more of a predilection? Their body processes things differently. The addiction cycle is much more locked and loaded for them. How do you handle that in the work that you do for people you are encouraging to explore the sober life?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I always ask this question of like, because I hear this all the time, right? It's like my grandfather like struggled with alcohol and so did my mom. And so this is why it's going to be extra hard for me. And my question is, how does that serve you? Like, how does that serve you? And I am not negating that that is a thing. However, there also isn't a soul alcohol gene, right? There's not an alcoholic gene. You can't go get a blood test and be labeled an alcoholic. You can't pee on anything, right? You can't get it from saliva. There are genetic predispositions, but there isn't an alcoholic one singular gene. And I think that's really encouraging because it means that there's hope and freedom for anybody, that it doesn't matter necessarily that your parents struggled, that there is freedom is on the table for you. It might be harder, but I think that also goes back to it's additional conditioning, right, of how we were raised. And if you are looking at the dinner table every single night and there's a bottle of wine on the table, you've given a lot of jobs because you were raised with what alcohol was doing and what the benefits are in that. But I think there's so much hope for everybody in this, and that even if your parents struggled, even if your grandparents struggled, siblings, whatever, that there is hope if you get to the reasons behind why you're drinking in the first place and give yourself grace and compassion to explore this. Like, it's not a foregone conclusion that you're going to have to struggle forever if your parents struggled.
Thank you to our sponsor, George Fox University. George Fox University is unique. It is a Christ-centered, student-focused university where your student is going to be appreciated for the individual they are, the learning style, and the goals that they have, while also keeping focus on their relationship with Christ. I want you to go check it out at georgefox.edu. Again, that's georgefox.edu. Thanks so much for being our sponsor, George Fox. How do you advise people who come to you where you begin to realize there's probably going to need to be a different level of support? And by that, what I mean is for people who are drinking at a certain level, to stop cold turkey can actually be catastrophic for their health. So
100%.
We talk about, and I love the subtitle of your book, talking about going on a 40-day fast from alcohol. And I think for people in a certain category, that's really powerful. There are those individuals who probably need to have a medicated step down from this. How do you distinguish that? And not trying to put you on the spot or saying this is medical advice. I'm just saying, there are those people who are going to need a little bit more support, medical support, in order to really explore what their relationship with alcohol is. How do you help them find that?
Yeah, 100%. And I think this is the thing, the gray area drinking pool in women is huge, right? And so the percentage of women that do need a medical detox is a lot smaller than I think that we think that it is. But if you need alcohol to wake up in the morning, if you are getting the shakes, if you are having serious physical, effects of your drinking, 100%, always see a doctor. Always see a doctor, because there are people that need to go through a medical detox. But this book is for the gray area drinking woman who probably doesn't need that level of support. This is a book that can then come probably in later after that medical detox, because I think you have to do the work on getting into your subconscious beliefs of why you like to drink and all the things that we talked about at some point if you want to lose the desire to drink. But that's a roundabout way of saying that, like, if you think that that's a possibility that you need that, then that's your doctor is your first protocol for sure.
Right. Absolutely. And, there's probably that listener, Christy, who says, well, in my world, I'm not the one struggling. I don't have a desire for it. I don't use it in that way. It's not my thing. But they have someone they're concerned about. There's a woman in their small group who can't seem to get through a prayer time or a Bible study without having a glass of wine. They are concerned about that person. There's someone at their discussion table at their mom's group that they are aware is making reference more and more to being hungover over the weekend, something like that.
Yeah.
How do we lovingly, non-judgmentally, with compassion, express to someone that we're concerned and point them in the direction of some of the resources you have? Or is that something that we need to leave alone? Like, guide us in this, who we're supposed to be as community members for those who may be showing an uptick in their drinking and reliance on alcohol.
Yeah, I honestly think that vulnerability and openness is like obviously just so important for so many reasons, but is also so key here. And so if you know somebody that is struggling and you have any story about alcohol, because I feel like every single woman, if you've had a drink at one point or another, have like not wanted the second drink, but had it, or had that one crazy night out, or whatever it was, where you know what it feels like to struggle, even if it's not in the same realm as that person that you're worried about. Come to them and say, like, I know it's hard. Like, this thing happened to me too. Like, I know it can be hard, but I also know that there's hope and support, and that times are changing too, right? We mentioned this, like, it's okay now to be sober curious. It's okay. Like, it's a health thing. It's a health hack. And so I would just be vulnerable. I mean, I don't want to like flog the book, but recommend the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I wish it was there when I was going through this. And just be there for them. I've done the thing where I had a girlfriend who was really, really struggling, and I would just make dates to go on walks with her, and just be there for her. And it wasn't about giving advice, and it wasn't about telling her to stop drinking, and it wasn't about giving her any sort of like plan. It was just being there for her and her knowing that she could talk to me about it. So that's also what I would say. Just be there for that person. No, you tell them that you're there and they can talk about it if they want to.
Right. And I want to encourage the listener too. I mean, part of being in the sisterhood of Christ is that we don't take a freedom we may have or something that is not a struggle for us and burden someone else with it. And what I mean by that is, you never know where somebody is on this scale, what they're challenged with. There are people who are very good at hiding they have any kind of problem. You may have zero verbal indicator or window into this could be something they're struggling with. And part of my concern is, while I don't want to be legalistic in our faith circles, and I think that has its own kind of risk, it really does concern me, Christy, that we've gotten a little blind, a little insensitive in a freedom we might have in a way that is really impactful and destructive for someone else. So what is that attitude adjustment that we need to make, that we need to be thinking about? I mean, in my tenure in women's ministry, when we had something that was a church sponsored thing we were doing, we didn't have alcohol. That just made it so much simpler. It was clean and easy. I wasn't making any kind of statement about what anyone chose to do. I was just trying to make it as easy as possible for whoever was going to be there. I mean,
Yeah.
are there things like that, practices like that we need to be considering, while at the same time extending people the freedom that if it's not an issue for them, then they can have their freedom?
Yeah. I mean, this is such a tricky one because like push comes to shove, like and again, we know so much more now, right? Alcohol is ethanol. It's a highly addictive drug, right? It is addictive, which is why people end up struggling with it. And so it's really, really hard then to go to a Bible study or church activity where there is a highly addictive drug being served. But again, going back to like the societal conditioning, we've been kind of like programmed to think that that's normal, right? And like, so it's just about, I would just have everybody ask that question for themselves. Like, is that normal? Right. And is it normal to like, would we do the same thing with cigarettes? Right. Like probably not, I would guess. And that's because we know so much more about how tobacco works, and we're getting there with alcohol. So it's really, really hard because I find this question really, really tricky. And it reminds me of when I was pitching the book and I started to go down the route of like, no, it's really addictive and it's really bad for us. And this is, it separates women from God. And I was like really going for it. And the publisher was like, well, we could never, ever say that. That's too strong. You can't say that people can't drink. And I said, well, I'm not saying that people cannot drink. I'm just saying, let's look at it for what it really is and what we really know about it and how it affects us now based on the current science, And so it's a tricky one. It's a tricky question.
Yeah. And it's probably a conversation we're going to continue to have. The more we learn about neurology, the more we learn about the way all of our body chemicals work together. I mean, I think it will be an ongoing conversation as we move forward. I appreciate you stepping out there and saying, hey, I'm raising my hand. These are things I've seen. These are the people I'm talking to. This is the experience that I've had. It at least allows the conversation to start rolling and start rolling from an informed place. So, Christy, I thank you so much. You've allowed me to keep you even longer. I'm so glad this is going to be a two-parter. I love when that happens, when the conversation keeps going.
We love a two-parter on our podcast.
Absolutely. We love a two-parter. So I want to make sure the listener knows that the book is called Love Life Sober. I think that is such a great name. And it is about how to take a 40-day journey alcohol-free to help reset your habits, to reconnect with yourself, to take a good look at the job that you're giving alcohol and your relationship to it. Christy, you also have a podcast, all kinds of other great resources. Where can the listener go to interact with you, ask questions, hear all the great stuff that you're doing?
Yeah. So for the book, it's lovelifesober40dayfast.com. And that's 40 the numbers. My podcast is all the places your podcast is, Apple, Spotify, and it's called But Jesus Drank Wine and Other Stories That Kept Us Stuck. We release new episodes every Monday, and I'm on Instagram at lovelifesober with Christy. And so, yeah, any of those places.
Perfect. Well, Christy, again, can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing what your experience has been, and from dialing all the way in from London, because that means that we had to make some adjustments to what times we could meet because you're ahead of me on the clock. But again, I really appreciate you, Christy. Thanks again for all that you do.
Oh, thank you. This was so wonderful. I loved it. Thank you.
All right, listener, you know where to go. Those show notes, Rebecca puts them together each week, and you're going to find all the links, all the great stuff there. I want to hear from you on this episode. Be sure and grab the link to the episode, send it to a friend, to someone you know who would benefit from this conversation. And I would love for you to come over to Instagram. I'm Julie Lyles Carr there. Go to my DMs. Let me know what you thought about this conversation. Also be sure that you're following AllMomDoes on the socials. Check out the blog at allmomdoes.com. All kinds of great resources for you there as well. A community of women who can come alongside you, support you in all the things you're experiencing in your life today. And I will see you next time on the AllMomDoes podcast.